cities and NGOs, including ESPA Romania, opening some things to happen.
Well, hello everyone. My name is Sam Fleming. I'm the Bureau Chief of the Financial Times here in Brussels. It's great to be here, great to have the audience with us today for this discussion about Europe's strategic defense security priorities. Well, yesterday NATO said there were no indications that the missile that had landed in Poland was a result of a deliberate attack. But the loss of life, tragic loss of life, and the danger of that incident just underlines how dangerous the situation we are in at the moment is in Europe, and the constant possibility for this conflict to spiral more broadly. The conflict has had enormous repercussions for Europe. We all know that over the past half a year, 8-9 months. Just consider how much has changed. The reinvigoration of NATO following the Afghanistan withdrawal last year, the increased transatlantic cooperation we've seen in areas of, such as sanctions and export controls, Germany's pledges to break with its previous arguable neglect of defense in this Titan Defender speech by Olaf Scholz, the radical weaning of the EU from Russian energy, which has happened more quickly than some people expected, and the vows to extend strategic autonomy for the European Union. So how do we assess Europe's security situation today, and is there a convincing vision for European security and defense? I have an extremely distinguished panel of guests with me today to discuss these issues. Mircea Joana is the Deputy Secretary General of NATO, a position he assumed in October 2019, making him the first Deputy Secretary General from his country, Romania, also a former President of the country's Senate. And Stefano Sannino is the Secretary General of the European External Action Service here in Brussels, a post he's held since 2021, previous Italian ambassador to Spain and a former ambassador to the European Union as well. Welcome to both of you. A reminder to our audience, you can submit questions here by raising your hand later. We will take time for questions, but also via the Slido platform if you're watching online. Well, let me just pick up where I left off with my introduction. There's been a massive reassessment of European security priorities and resources because of the war, and obviously not confined to Germany, but a broader one across the EU. But arguably, this is a journey that is still in its early stages. So, Deputy Secretary General, let me ask you, first of all, what are the top priorities now from here when it comes to European security? And is the EU still, or Europe still, overly reliant on the United States?
You know, the war that Russia started against the innocent Ukraine is, by any means, a game changer. And for some countries in Western Europe, it was also a very rude awakening to a brutal reality that the world is a tough place to be. And many of us, or many of the young ones in Europe, and probably also across the alliance, we never imagined that war could come back on European soil. And the European Union, European communities were founded, and NATO, we were founded almost 75 years back on the idea to secure peace and to have our values at the cornerstone of everything we do. So this war is changing massively the way in which in NATO, I believe in the EU, and also individual nations across the transatlantic area are looking at security. There are a couple of evolutions that are still to be defined. Economically, economic model, energy transition, technological revolution. But the one thing in terms of hard security is clear. There is no way to ensure European security without a strong transatlantic link, and NATO at the cornerstone of this. I think this is the self-evident issue. Then with Stefano and his team, and also with Josep Borrell and many others, we've been working very closely as the two organizations who are preparing our fundamental document, strategic concept for NATO, which was adopted by our leaders in Madrid, and also the compass. And I remember that many times Stefano and our colleagues, we've been exchanging information. It's very interesting to look in parallel how NATO is looking at the world now and for the next decade, and how the EU is looking to the world. And I have to say there are many things that are similar, and they should be. And I think in terms of NATO-EU, this is an indispensable partnership. And I think the way that NATO brings security and collective defense, what the EU is bringing in many other fields, is something that we should put together. Because the competition is not only to help Ukraine prevail in this war, and they will, and will continue to help Ukraine, but it's also many other things around the world. The rise of China, which is a fundamental shift. Resilience, cyber, hybrid, space, disinformation, a very broad climate change and security, a very broad definition of security. So to be honest, irrespective of, the instincts that might exist in some capitals in Europe, the second conclusion of mine, I'll stop here, there is absolutely, in a way, counterproductive to dissipate resources and be divergent when it comes to NATO and the EU. We need to be convergent. And after Sweden and Finland will be joining our ranks, and we hope to have the two great new members, new allies soon, 96% of the population in the EU will be living in a NATO country too. 96. And just a PR for my organization, we looked at the recent polls in America, in Europe, and I think NATO is perceived as being very popular and very useful by close to 80% of the public opinion. So we need to work together, and we are working together, and together with Stefano, myself, and also, Josep Borrell, and President von der Leyen, and President Michel, and Jens Stoltenberg, our Secretary General, I think we are doing our best to try to bring these two organizations together.
Secretary General.
Maybe I will start from where Mircea left, because I think that what he was implying in his line of reasoning, that the concept of security has become much broader than it used to be before. And essentially, you have on the one side the hard security, the military aspect, and on the other side, you have a number of other components that are getting into the picture. Cyber, hybrid disinformation, the instrumentalization of policies. Energy has become clearly one of those, but also migration or trade or economic links. Economic coercion is also part of this equation. So I mean, the concept has become much broader. We had been accustomed to see either a sort of conventional war or the other, let's say, the other components. And this war has brought the two together and has generated a sense that, as Mircea was saying, we need to get our acts together because the security theater has become one. And there is no longer a distinction between the Atlantic and the Pacific, because I mean, threats can come from every corner, and so we will need to be ready and prepared to work on all these strands. I think that the war has been an awakening. I would say that we have had already some sort of wake-up call. I mean, I speak about the European Union during the COVID crisis, when we realized that the over-dependence on certain products or on certain medicines was problematic and was creating a sort of lack of capacity to respond to the needs of our population. It was also, you were mentioning the point of the strategic autonomy. We had discussed a lot about this, but we had also had the point of the investments in sectors that were key to our security. Remember all the work that we've done on 5G. So I think that it's not, this has been a sort of turning point, but there were a lot of signs on which we have started working in order to address these vulnerabilities. One thing that I think it's important, and it's good that we discuss about this openly, is that all this has a cost. Defense has a cost, and now our member states are committed to using much more financial resources to increase our defense capacity, but also the security as a whole, the diversification of the supply chains has a cost. And these costs have to be included and factor in our production processes. And that's the work that we are also doing now and for the future, for what could be possible threats and challenges coming from other places. There is another point which I think it is important that we understand as European Union, as 27, that not only do we have to spend more, but that we have to spend better, and that we need to avoid duplications, we need to avoid programs for each country. So we are trying to consolidate also the European industrial basis. We are trying to, in order to be more effective and more efficient, the European Defence Fund, the idea of the joint procurement, there are all elements that are coming into the fore. And I think that it's important to mention, and I mean this is something that we have discussed several times with Mircea, but also with the colleagues in NATO, that this set of capabilities that we are developing is not EU or NATO, but it's for those countries that are both members of the European Union and allies in NATO, but also for those countries who are not. I mean, also our, let's say, security element within the European Union is important to take into account also the sensitivities of, let's say, the 4% of the EU who is not a NATO member. Final point that I would like to make is about the partnerships, because this is a very key point. And I cannot agree more, and this is something that I have said several times. I mean, Mircea was kind enough to invite me to the North Atlantic Council a few times, and my line has always been the problem is not the difference between EU and NATO, which is relatively minimal, but it's the problem that we both have vis-à-vis challenges that are coming from outside and that we need to face together. And I think that the work that we have been doing up until now in all different areas, from cyber to disinformation, to the work on space or on maritime security, I mean, all these are extremely relevant, and I think that we can be mutually reinforcing. I'm always stressing the fact that there are moments or areas where maybe the alliance has more problems to come in, and it's easier maybe for the European Union with the new instrument that we have, and what we have managed to prove also with the use of the European Peace Facility to finance and to help supporting our member states in supplying armaments to Ukraine, which is a economic importance, but it's also of political importance, because it was a moment where essentially the European Union as such was assuming responsibility, political responsibility for this. So I think that it's key, of key importance, the work that we are doing together with NATO, with key allies within NATO. You were speaking about the transatlantic link, but I mean, I'm not shying away from saying that also with UK it's very important, the work that we are doing, or with Canada, or with Norway, or with Iceland. I mean, it's all partners are relevant, but I would like to go even beyond, because as I was saying, since the security theater is one, it's also with other like-minded countries on the other side of the globe. I'm thinking particularly the Pacific, I'm thinking about Japan, I'm thinking about New Zealand, I'm thinking about Australia, South Korea, Singapore, and many more that have the same kind of preoccupation for the development of the situation in our world, and that are willing to work with us in a very cooperative spirit.
Deputy Secretary General, Stefano Orsino just mentioned the importance of the industrial side, the common procurement, the idea of more joint efforts when it comes to military hardware. The EU, the EES, I think, did put out its defense gaps analysis back in May, right, which talked about learning the lessons from problems in procurement in the past. We have seen this movie before, however. This has been a long-standing effort within the European Union to consolidate, have less duplication. You know, we don't need the number of different kinds of tanks doing the same sort of thing that we do. Is there any reason from what you see in NATO at the moment to think that we're at a different moment when it comes to joint procurement and a more consolidated industrial base when it comes to European security?
When I mentioned a rude awakening, this is not only the fact that we are seeing war, and war is such a horrible thing to have, but there are many consequences coming from that strategic awakening, mainly here in I would say, in Western Europe. And this is EU and non-EU. Why? Because of geography, because of America's umbrella for many long decades. So I think NATO is, in a way, indirectly helping the EU and European nations to do a much better job in fighting fragmentation and lack of scale of the defense sector in Europe. It's also our interest. And because we have this dual reality, we are helping Ukraine, and we see now all allies helping Ukraine. And if you look to the former Ramstein process, the support group for Ukraine, you have now 50 nations around the world, 50 nations, 5-0, in the process of working together to help Ukraine get the kind of support they need. Military, humanitarian, and of course, economic and macroeconomic. And here the EU is doing also a great job. But we also know that our industry, across the Atlantic, but also in Europe, they need clarity, because also our stocks are getting depleted. We see the fact that our Ukrainian friends, when they get support from us, they see that the same 155 millimeter thing, one produced in one country in Europe, the caliber is the same, but you cannot use it. Why? Because there's some national small things that are making that protection for that industry. So why I say we are helping indirectly the EU, because we have started, and I chaired yesterday, I think the 5th of the national armament directors meetings, because the only place, and I say this with no arrogance, the only practical place where industry has clarity about the future and the needs of all allies is NATO. Through the defense planning process, through the investment and defense pledge. And by the way, we had a pledge of 2% in Wales back in 2014, I think, Benedetta. Yeah. And then in Vilnius at the summit of next year, we'll be going and revisiting our investment pledge. So what we are doing now, we have at least for one decade ahead, in a very visible way, through the planning process of each of the allies, including EU member states, seeing what kind of needs are there. And industry then can hire, go to the banks and get a credit, ramp up production. And speaking of the pandemic, not to have the same situation like other industries, that when the pandemic was going down, the demand was getting lower. We cannot ask our defense sector. And then economy of scale, and in a way, we are also looking in NATO to see a stronger European defense sector. So in a way, there is a synergy between what we do and what the EU is trying to acquire. CARD is very useful, but the only place where you have visibility for 32 allies, and in terms of defense budgets and investments, is in NATO, and that's a way in which I think we are working together in a very, I think, subtle but intelligent way.
Stefano, I was struck this week, last week maybe it was, the early drafts of the, or latest drafts of the European Defence Industry Reinforcement through Common Procurement Act, a bit of a mouthful, suggests that the EU fund which would be used for this could actually be used to purchase third country equipment as well. There had been an initial idea from some parts of the European Union, prizes for guessing where, that this should be focused on European Union procurement, but actually it can be used elsewhere. Is there a potential in this reinforcement of European defence that actually an awful lot of the business ends up being done by US contractors? Or do you think that there is a genuine potential now for consolidated procurement on a big scale in the European Union, creating more common platforms?
The answer to your question is that the purpose of this exercise is to help creating a European basis. And that's remain the main point that we want to achieve for the reason that Mircea was mentioning, because we need to face, and that's the second part of the question, unfortunately the needs have become much bigger, and we will need to face all them. So I think I'm not an expert in defense industrial policy, but I think that there is sufficient room for everybody from that point of view. The market is large enough to for everybody. I think that the key from that point of view is how we interact among, let's say, the big players. And once again, I want to include in this line of reasoning also the UK, which is also an important partner from the industrial point of view. We need to be able to have economy of scale in Europe, because otherwise we will continue to be unable to support the effort of our member states and of the alliance as a whole in a sufficient way. And we need to make it sure that market is open from all points of view. I mean, you were speaking about strategic autonomy. We always add the open strategic autonomy, the idea that it's not a protectionist attitude, but we need, and I'll say very, let's say plainly and also in a very friendly manner, that the same is happening in other markets, and that there are no security reasons that are then creating exclusions or difficulties in the market. So we are making a huge effort, also in the context, for example, of the European Defence Agency, to come to some arrangements that can allow the United States to participate into our projects. But this is also an effort on the US side to eliminate the restrictions that they have when it comes to the export of these products, because if they have a US component, I mean, we need to have, let's say, a chain of supply which is based on trust, and this is the main point. So I think that there are a lot of elements that needs to be worked on, but the sense of direction for me is quite clear, and we need to assess, let's say, as Mircea was saying, the needs of the capabilities against the overall needs that we have in the alliance. So trust, confidence, and openness.
Let me add something. You know, the EU is very proud, and that's something I'm a EU citizen myself, so I'm a strong believer in the European project, of the power of regulation that they have. Very good. That's something that you try to put to the best possible use. If there is a similar, you know, unique feature of NATO, I would call the power of standardization. Because the lessons learned in our support to Ukraine, and the fact that our own stockpiles are depleted, and we try to do a better job in replenishing them, and also try to do a better job in creating, you know, critical mass visibility and the capacity to have joint procurement. You cannot do joint procurement if you have different standards in each of the countries. So one of the things we are working on is to make sure that the standards for any kind of equipment will be a NATO standard. This means that also for European Union member states that have difficulties. Why? Because there is a national sovereign interest to defend your own national defense sector. That's a reality. I'm a political guy, so I'm not in the business of pretending that reality is not here. But what NATO does now, because of the lessons learned from Ukraine, that we cannot afford in NATO and indirectly also in EU member states, just to go to equipments that cannot speak to each other or work together. So we create indirectly again an advantage for EU, because the standards will be the same, and then joint acquisition, joint platforms, minimizing fragmentation. And then in the end, let the best win. Let the best win. It's an American, a Canadian, and a British, or Italian, or French, or a German, or Romanian company. They should compete, and we should create some minimum of conditions for them to compete freely. Because there is a reality that some European nations have a stronger defense sector, and others don't. And my job at NATO, as chair of the Innovation Board, and that's the other major thing that NATO brings, and also EU indirectly is benefiting from that, or it should benefit from that, is interoperability. Because we might have a situation in the future that some of the most advanced nations, so the most advanced armed forces, are going into a technological surge of their armed forces, and even if we acquire things, we cannot fight together. So in a way, one or another, NATO is helpful also for the EU efforts to do a better job when it comes to defense and critical mass. It's the interest of NATO for European allies to have a stronger industrial base. This is our interest, because it means that all of us will be interoperable. And to put it more bluntly, everybody should have a piece of the cake. We also need jobs. Not only in 2 or 3 countries, we need jobs everywhere, in the Czech Republic, in Estonia, in Bulgaria, in wherever. So that's an interesting transformation of the way we are looking at defense and procurement. And also, EU is helping us, because if you do joint procurement methods, it means that we can also amplify that and use it to a larger scale in NATO. So that's a synergy between us, and that's the convergence between what NATO does and EU does that I mentioned at the beginning.
We'll take questions from the audience shortly. Before I do, another EAS paper, which came out quite recently on China, Secretary General, was notable for the shift in tone, I think. It's been an ongoing process, but it was the latest example of a shift towards seeing China more as an all-out competitor. We've now had the midterm results, so we know that the one piece of bipartisanship really that exists in Washington is on China policy and the shift to a more hawkish direction. What do you see as the most important priorities for the EU now when it comes to pushing this agenda? And I wanted to particularly ask about the issue of export controls by the US on semiconductors, which obviously are directed very strongly in China. Is the EU under pressure to implement a similar regime here to the one that's been imposed by the US on China?
Many questions at the same time. I think that we need to collectively come to terms with the reality and what China is and China represents in the world in this moment. I don't speak about the future, what could be the evolution of China in a number of years, because it's very interesting speculating about whether or not it's becoming a middle income trap, but it's for the sake of the practitioners, those who need to make political choices and develop policies. What is interesting for me is what's happening in a sort of foreseeable future. So China is a reality. I don't know if the largest or the second largest economy in the world. It is a political reality which is unavoidable. So and it is also very clear that China has started a much more assertive course politically, economically, in defining a model that they believe is in a way alternative ideologically to our model. So we will have, that's why I'm speaking much more about competition. That's why I think that the two models will compete in the future. But the point is, how are we going to manage this competition, and which are the instruments, the means that we have in managing this competition? And when I say this, I think that there is also a sort of respect for China, because it means that we are recognizing the fact that it has the potential to have a leading role in the world. I think that the main point is. nobody think about decoupling or delinking from China. Economically, the interest, reciprocal interest is very relevant. But at the same time, we need to be aware also of the fact that if we want to avoid the risk of over-dependencies, we have to manage also the economic relations. I was mentioning before the 5G. That was a way of managing this complexity. You have mentioned the anti-coercion measures. This is also a way of managing this complexity, the screening on foreign direct investments. There are all elements that are relevant in order to, let's say, manage the economic competition. But I would add that there is also a political competition model that they are trying to export, a Chinese development model, a Chinese cooperation model. And that is also interesting to look at because we have our own willingness to project this, let's say, ourselves towards the third countries, and sometimes or many times we have to face this competition. And in that case too, we need to be more if I would say so, not humble, but understanding that we have in front of us countries that can make their choices and that are not bound by the fact that we believe that our model is more sustainable, correct, human rights respectful, but they may be interested also in other things that Chinese model is offering. So I mean, in that case too, we need to be able to adjust our strategies, and Global Gateway is one of the responses that we have elaborated to this. I mean, it's a way of defining partnership with third countries in a different manner. The third point that I think it's important in this global competition is on the technological side, because it is evident that the Chinese are, let's say, betting a lot on the technological component. And hence, in that case too, we need to be careful about how we work with them. I mean, as you do with any economic competitor. So it's that's an element that we are taking into account, and I want to stress that, especially with, and particularly with this U.S. administration, we are working in a very cooperative spirit, in a very, I would say, consensual manner. We are sitting at the table. I mean, I'm co-chairing together with Wendy Sherman the EU-US dialogue on China. And this is now I will, at the beginning of December, be in Washington for the 5th round of this dialogue. And that's where we are assessing, and then where we are getting closer in the way we define our policies vis-à-vis China. So I wouldn't say pressure, but I would say that we try to get to the common understanding of how to work on in certain areas.
I'm open to questions here from the audience. I have a few also from Slido, so do raise your hand if you had a question here in the audience. If not, I'll go straight to our online audience as well. Let me pick up one of those online questions, which is on the EU-NATO declaration. It's been repeatedly delayed, as the questioner implies. When do we expect this declaration, and is there anything tangible that it's going to achieve change in any way? Well, what's the purpose of this exercise at this stage?
You know, already have a massive foundation of our partnership between NATO and EU. We do a lot together, a lot. And this is something that sometimes needs, of course, to be structured probably better, to be even more efficient and more meaningful, but we have a solid foundation. And I'm hopeful, and all of us are hopeful, because we invested a lot, also personally and our staffs, into this effort. I'm optimistic that we'll be able to reach the third declaration and being signed by our leaders soon. But we can also, I think, say what will, not in terms of the language, but in terms of the new dimensions of our partnership between NATO and the EU. And Stefano, you can correct me if I'm forgetting anything. Emerging disruptive technologies, resilience, cyber, space, disinformation, and everything else. And of course, in an elegant way, our EU colleagues are very diplomatic sometimes, how to manage great power competition. You can understand eventually what we're trying to say by that. So it's an indication that both organizations are understanding this broader definition of security. Is hard security? Yes. This NATO is the indispensable player, but there are also multifaceted issues of security. We need to work together. And together, we are bringing not only expertise, but critical mass. And speaking a little bit of China, I chair the innovation board in NATO. And we are looking very attentively also in the last party congress, the ambition to become a nuclear power relatively soon, China, at par with the United States and the Russian Federation, at par. To outperform us in AI and quantum, and any other of the technologies that are, of course, important for the economy. I concur with Stefano that that's also some form of commercial and economic cooperation, but there is also very stiff competition for keeping our technological edge. This is not a small feat. So, yeah, the answer, in short, is we'll have it, I hope, soon. And then we can really build on what we have done, do a better job at what we already do, and then explore this broader definition of security, and where NATO and the EU are indispensable partners.
Did you want to add anything?
Little to add. I think that, again, for me, what is really relevant, and Mircea has mentioned the new areas that we add to the old areas where we are already cooperating and working together. So to be honest, I think that the substance is more relevant than anything else. And if and when we will have this declaration, it's more than welcome. But what is important is that we keep on working on substance, because that's the real point of the security of our citizens. And I think that both institutions, also because the political leaders of this, let's say, of the member states and of the allies largely coincide. They have what they care about, the security of their citizens.
There's a question about the transatlantic element again. Maybe just if you could pick that one up. It's a question about what this questioner describes as presidential instability in the US. I think this is a reference to the potential, given he's announced a second run for Donald Trump to become president, and once again undermine aspects of this transatlantic alliance, as we did see under his presidency. To what extent does that hang over people's minds today, or is it a question for a year's time, or perhaps, never?
The proof of the cake is in eating it. So we'll see at the moment if a plan happens, and then if the approach will be the same or will be different. We are in a different also geostrategic landscape. So. And I hope that in any case, what we have managed to build during these years is creating, let's say, more solid foundation in the overall relationship. I think that we need to see the entirety of the transatlantic relation. Again, there is political, there is an economic, there is a cultural, there is a social and personal dimension. It's pluridimensional, and more than everything else, there is a convergence of interests that is moving in the same direction. But first of all, we have still 2 years to go, and a lot of work is in front of us, a lot of challenges that we have to face. So I think that we need to stay focused on achieving results today.
Deputy Secretary General.
Yeah, I know America well. I was ambassador there. I have many friends, and I can say one thing. that the bipartisan support and the public opinion support in America for NATO is very solid, very solid. And the power of America's alliances in NATO, in Europe, but also in other corners of the world is something that in itself is a guarantee you know, leaders change, democracy brings to power the people, the choice of the people. But I would say that we see a very solid bipartisan and public support for NATO in the US. And probably sometimes also politically, you need sometimes also a small pretext to say that, no, America is strong and stable and committed to its alliances. They also need us. America needs all of us, the big and small allies, because together we can face together the challenges of this very turbulent century ahead of us. So not much concern about America's leadership and bipartisan support for NATO.
We have only a couple more minutes. Before we do, we've spoken a lot about the broader picture. We also, as everyone is acutely aware, have a war which is ongoing. That war has seen important strategic developments this week with the withdrawal from Russia of Kherson. I wonder if you could give us your sense going into the winter now as to how the latest changes on the battlefield affect the balance in that war and what you're expecting next.
What the Ukrainians have been doing as a nation and as a military is nothing short of remarkable, by any standard. And of course, they receive a lot of support from all of us, and that's also enabling them to do an excellent job on the battleground. And let's remember that only 9 months back, there were people questioning how long Ukraine would be able to resist this huge country, which is Russia. And of course, Russia is not the military superpower in terms of the quality of command and control, and they made many mistakes. But Ukrainians are just to be congratulated for the bravery and sacrifice that they are doing. So we see a relatively stabilized front line because of the winter season. Of course, we see this brutal and indiscriminate attacks from Russia on civilian infrastructure with a very explicit interest to cripple the energy system, and thus hoping that the will of the Ukrainian people will somehow be less solid. And also the incident of a few days back is also the fact that they are starting to bombard also the western part of Ukraine. Because they want to make sure that if there will be people inside Ukraine leaving because of the problem of lack of electricity or heating or whatever, and moving towards the western part of Ukraine, to make sure that this is happening. But we anticipate Ukraine to continue to push for regaining its territories, their territories. And, but we do not anticipate, massive breakthroughs in the next few months, because just the season is not allowing massive operations. In the spring, probably we'll be seeing more dynamic situation on the battlefield.
Thank you very much, Secretary General. Secretary General, thank you as well. Thank you to our audience. Please join me in thanking our two panelists.
Thank you. Okay.